So we were investigating the crowding out effect. Stop chatting. We were investigating the crowding out effect, and we had talked about how the increase in government spending increases aggregate demand. So it increases by the same amount. So if the government spends $20 billion, aggregate demand shifts right by $20 billion. Okay. But now we have a higher output level. We have an increased GDP, which means that money demand is going to increase and interest rate will increase. So the increased output increases money demand, which thus increases the interest rate. There's your increased interest rate right there. Okay. How could you possibly have foretold that you would need to write something in this class with a sharpened pencil?
I thought my mechanical pencil.
Enough. All right, so that increased interest rate then does what to consumption and investment? Decreases them, which then is going to bring GDP back. So we don't end up back at the original point, but we end up somewhere in between, and that is the crowding out. So when you went from 1 to 2, that's the benefit of that increased government spending. That's exactly what Congress was thinking. Yes, we increased GDP. Way to go, us. And then the money demand increases, raising interest rates. Congress is pretty oblivious. Those increased interest rates make investment more expensive, so investment declines. And we end up with a slightly decreased GDP. Keep in mind also, this crowding out includes the fact that in order to increase that government spending, the government had to borrow, and thus they are crowding out other borrowers from the money market. Remember when we talked about crowding out in the money market and how deficit spending affects that? That's how we go. Got it, got it? Good. All right, so let's change taxes, okay? Let's cut taxes and increase everybody's take-home pay. Yay, we just did this, IRL, okay? So households then are going to spend at least some portion of that extra income. What do we happen? Demand increases, okay? How much does demand increase? Multiplier effect, crowding out are both going to play into those. Is that tax cut permanent or is it temporary? Are households thinking, yes, this money is mine forever, or is it a 1-year tax cut, a 6-month tax cut? Okay. That matters. It factors into spending habits. A permanent tax cut makes people feel wealthier and increases their consumption by a larger amount. What? Okay. So the more the consumption curve shifts, more aggregate demand increases, and the better the effect that Congress was hoping for. All right, practice time. There's your scenarios. Do your math. Think. All right, if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, people are going to spend 80% of their additional income. There's no crowding out. How much should Congress increase government spending to end the recession? It's math. Is it a division or a multiplication problem? We need to shift aggregate demand to the right by 200 billion. And the MPC of 0.8 tells us people are going to spend 80% of what they get extra.
That's correct.
The multiplier's what? Yep. So how much do we have to increase government spending? The multiplier is 5. If we increase government spending by 40 billion, and add that 40 billion is multiplied by 5, we come out to the 200 billion. Did your math backwards, you were dividing.
Yeah, they wanted to get 200 billion. I thought they had 200 billion. They wanted to get out, find out what was the.
200 billion will end it.
Oh, okay.
All right, so that was relatively easy if you were thinking about the math in the right direction.
Yeah.
This one's a little harder. Now there's crowding out. Does Congress still increase government spending by 40 billion? No? 30 billion? 20 billion? What? Wrong direction? 50 billion? 60 billion? Depends on how much crowding out there is, right? But we know it has to be more than 40 because 40 would just get us right there. Boom. That very concept will be on your AP exam. Guaranteed. What?
She's gonna make that question one exam question.
No, I'm saying when you sit for the actual exam, you'll see a crowding out fiscal monetary policy question. Guaranteed. All right. So, short run, fiscal policy affects aggregate demand. We know that. Almost everybody agrees on that. There's always that one guy, right? So we have to say almost everybody. It may also affect aggregate supply. Does it? Does it not? It depends. Okay. People respond to incentives. So, if we cut the tax rate, meaning you get to keep more of your money, what might you also be incentivized to do? We know you're already incentivized to spend when you get to keep more of your money. What else might you do?
Save and invest.
You're already, what you don't spend, you have to save. Closed system. Do you want more money? Since you get to keep more money, do you want more money? So what do? Work more. You might work more. So if you work more, that means that output goes up, so we're supplying more goods and services. Go get a second job because you get to keep more of the money you're going to make. Hot dog. Right? So we could end up shifting aggregate supply to the right with a tax cut. We could end up shifting aggregate supply to the left with a tax increase.
Oh. Can't you just assume that the taxes drop, that would also affect the corporate tax? And so the cost of inputs, the cost of produce is less, so you push.
Not necessarily.
Why wouldn't that? I mean, I know the corporate tax would have to be directly affected, but I'm assuming that would also change taxes.
They're separate parts of the tax code. And a lot of times what happens with the corporate tax, they're doing in hopes that it trickles down. But what they're doing here is direct impact when they impact the taxpayer, the citizen. That's what we're generally talking about with fiscal policy.
Corporations tax less. You're not saying they will increase more, or they will.
If corporations tax less,
The corporate
it's
tax
more
is very
difficult
low.
although the courts think that corporations are humans or are citizens, they don't necessarily act with human behavior. They're more difficult to predict because they're not governed by the same motivations. A board is governing and they're responsible to shareholders, and so profit is always going to be their primary motive. So
they
just
will
because their tax is lower, that doesn't mean that they're going to produce
they're
more.
Rather than put it back into the company, produce more.
They're more inclined to pay dividends or to do something else with that money than to just turn around and...
That makes sense.
Okay, so if you believe that people, when taxed less, will work more, resulting in a shift of aggregate supply, you are called a supply-side economist. Okay? Supply-side economics. Believing that tax changes affect the supply side. These folks don't deny that they affect the demand side, but they're saying it also impacts supply. Supply-side economists come and go in popularity. Government purchases can affect aggregate supply. If the government starts spending more money on roads, better roads, more roads, businesses can transport their goods faster, so that might make them more productive, might increase the quantity of goods and services, might result in a shift of aggregate supply to the right. That is not much of a short-term aggregate supply impactor. You guys watched as the government builds roads for us? Doesn't happen overnight, does it? It's a long-term impact. Long-term impact. All right, so how do we use government policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy to stabilize the economy? Because yes, we want growth, but more than growth, we want not bad. We don't want recessions. We don't want depressions. We don't want chaos and volatility. So how do we craft policy to make sure that things remain pretty stable? In 1946, the government passed the Employment Act to try and guarantee kind of that minimum level of unemployment, what we call the blank blank of unemployment. Natural rate of unemployment. Okay. Economists do not agree, and yes, it generally has a political affiliation bent to it as to which way they go. They don't necessarily agree on whether or not the government should be engaged in this policy. Should the government try to stabilize the economy? Lots and lots of economists say, no, stay out of it. Laissez-faire. Let the economy do what it's going to do. The problem with that is that we live in a system where we are anything but laissez-faire. There are all kinds of government regulations all over the place. And if the government is going to be limiting and regulating and stimulating in certain areas, the other economists on the other side are saying, well, if the government's already in there messing with everything and causing it to be perhaps more volatile than it would be on its own, then yes, of course, it's the government's responsibility to do what it can to stabilize it, to calm the seas. Okay, so those are kind of the two sides. All right, so should we have an active stabilization policy? There are some arguments in favor of it. Can you guess what we're going to talk about after this? Arguments against it. All right, Keynes. If you get the right pundit on TV, you can make a newscaster's head explode by using this phrase. Keynesian animal spirits. It's a direct quote from Keynes. He called them animal spirits. Folks today don't like that phrase because it kind of makes it sound like we don't have minds of our own and don't think rationally, we just react. Right? What Keynes is saying with this animal spirit thing is that consumers, the households they live in, are optimistic or pessimistic about the economy, about the world they live in. And if the animal spirits are pessimistic, the economy is going to go into decline. If the animal spirits are optimistic, the economy is going to be expansionary. Okay? Keynes said you can't control those animal spirits, so you have to do something to control their impact. Okay? He viewed stabilization policy as kind of the tetanus shot to the economy. Let's protect it if we can. There are other factors that definitely impact economic fluctuations. We cannot control what happens overseas. If the Asian markets go into a tailspin, there's nothing our economy could do, no matter how healthy it is, to avoid being pulled down by that, because we have embraced the concept of international trade, and we are relying on robust economies overseas to be consumers of our exports and to provide us with import goods. The government can't control whether the stock market is going to crash or whether it's going to go into a bull market in an expansionary period. Those who say, yeah, we have to have a stabilization policy in place say, if we don't do anything, things are too volatile, people are too unsure, and it decreases investment and consumption because people are living in constant fear. Think about it like living in an economic horror film. You're never sure when the next economic boom is going to jump out. And so if you stop and creep down every hallway and check 3 times around the door before you walk into a room, economically speaking, we don't grow very fast. There's trepidation. So, those folks who say that's not good for an economy say, here's what we ought to do. If GDP falls below its natural rate, we need to do something either monetarily or fiscally to correct that. We've got to push GDP out, at least to its natural rate, if not beyond. Okay? When GDP stays below its natural rate, you're toying with a recession. 3 consecutive quarters below natural rate of output equals recession. On the other hand, if GDP gets too far out, gets above its natural rate of output, then these stabilization folks are like, we could get into a really, really, really bad inflationary period, and then the only way to come back from that is to dive real low, so we're going to have to use some contractionary monetary and fiscal policy to pull that natural rate of GDP back. I mean, we don't want people to be afraid, but we don't want them to be exuberant either, because that's bad news too. Okay? We've had a couple of presidents who have been particularly Keynesian in their economic policy. In general, our presidents try to walk the middle road. JFK was dealing with some interesting economic things going on in his presidency, and he was pretty Keynesian about his approach. He very much followed a stimulus sort of governmental policy in terms of fiscal policy. Lots of stimulus programs, increased government spending, and part of that was because of our ever-increasing involvement in Vietnam during his time in place, and of course the ongoing arms race with the Soviets. Then this fella, some of you may recognize him. Okay?
Wow, who's that guy?
Yeah. Now remember, he came into office at the depths of a pretty doggone deep recession and continued policies that had been put in place by his predecessor, George W. Bush. But he took both fiscal policy arrows. He not only increased government spending, but he pushed through big tax cuts as well. He was being very aggressive. Traditionally, one arrow is what gets used. It's got to be pretty rough before they pull both arrows out, and even rougher before they shoot them both with the same draw. And that's exactly what they did in 2009. Did it twice. 2 rounds of government spending and 2 rounds of tax cuts. Worked. Worked well. All right, so let's flip to the other side. Nope. Let's not mess with the economy. Here's why. It takes too long to have any kind of impact. If you're going to mess with monetary policy, you're going to affect the money supply. Come on. Nobody makes those decisions overnight. If GM is going to build a factory, they don't decide on Monday, yep, we're gonna build a factory and break ground on Thursday. We're talking, they talk for a year about whether or not they need a new factory, and then look at where they're going to put it and what will it produce. And then in year number 2, they start saying, okay, well, how are we going to finance that factory? How big is it going to be? What's it going to cost us? Year 3, they start working on the plans for it. Year 4, they might borrow the money to start building the factory. Before it starts actually putting cars out, we're into year 6. Doesn't happen overnight. The school bond that we're going to vote on in May. When did they start talking about the need for a bond? 2 years ago. They started planning what would need to be included in the bond a year ago. They finally made their decisions in December. Yeah, then they revised them in January. If the bond is passed in May, then they can start actually finalizing plans, because nobody makes final plans until you've got the money ready. When will they break ground? Maybe fall on some of the stuff that's smaller renovation, kind of the security things. It's going to take a long time to get this stuff going, right? So that's what the people saying, it just isn't fast enough, go. Okay? The general rule of thumb, even by people who are in favor of stabilization policies, is that it takes at least 6 months for any change in monetary policy to begin impacting interest rates. That's a long time. Andrew, I am about to move you over here behind them. Fiscal policy also lags. Because Congress, and we all know, you've all studied prefixes, right? Yeah. Pro and con are opposites. Congress is the opposite of progress, as the old joke goes. Okay. It takes time. They've got to agree on something in order to change government spending or change tax policy. That can take, at a minimum, months, and more commonly, years. How many times in your lifetime has the government shut down? Not because government couldn't agree about a change in spending or taxation, but because government couldn't agree to keep spending what it had been spending. Government couldn't agree, Congress couldn't agree to continue paying its bills that it had already agreed to pay, let alone to change something. So no wonder these folks are like, stabilization policy, can't happen. They say that fiscal policy and monetary policy lag so far behind the actions that, or the circumstances that might necessitate stabilization, that they can actually destabilize the economy. Gavin, work with me. You look sad. You look sad today. Gavin's really sad. He's pretty depressed. He's seriously bummed out. I'm concerned about his well-being as his mother. I want to get him some help.
Yeah.
So I call for the doctor. Doctor can see us next week. Hold it together. So we get to the doctor. It's been a week. Doctor recommends counseling, gives us the name of counselor. 6 weeks. 6 weeks she can get us in to see her in 6 weeks. You're gonna be all right. Okay?
Now what happened?
So you get better after your first visit to the counselor?
Did he make it to the counselor?
He made it to the counselor.
He was still depressed that long?
Yeah.
Man.
I slept nights at the foot of his bed, just to be sure.
Really glad what there you are.
Yeah, man.
Right? This is the same scenario here, right? So either the help comes too late to do any good, or within 6 weeks, Gavin's gone, wait a minute, what am I bummed out about this grade in this one high school class? I'm out of here, I'm on to college, none of this matters, forget it. And he's look at that smile, what a happy boy. What a happy boy, right?
I've never really felt so
And they
much.
kick in, you know.
So then,
Please.
in this scenario, we're putting the corrective action into place. 3 weeks after Gavin graduates, I take him to the counselor, and she prescribes some meds, and we medicate somebody who's fine in the first place. 6 months or a year after the economy has recovered, the government action that was put in place to try and help the economy recovers kicks into place and exaggerates it in the wrong or the right direction, and then we need to do what?
Fix it.
Fix it again.
Fix it again! Quick! Call the doc, call the counselor, he's way too happy. We gotta get him off of these meds. Way too happy. And then his girlfriend breaks up with him the week after we took him off the meds, and then, quick, call the doc, call the counselor.
Bro, he's a goner now.
No. Oh.
We should just give up hope with yeah.
Wait, this right now. Just when? True love. True love.
Alright.
What are you doing?
No, I'll be today
Are
actually.
you doing
Alright.
okay?
So,
Did you get you in?
Yeah.
We have
because,
to call the doctor for Gavin. His girlfriend broke up with him actually.
No, I did that.
Oh.
that's why he's
You're
happy.
savage.
Oh.
Alright, so,
Oh, hell.
because we can't agree, should we stabilize, should we not? Government has done something called automatic stabilization. And it puts some policies in place. Put some policies in place that happen automatically, so that Congress doesn't have to agree on anything because they agreed a while ago. Just in case this happens, do this.
This one's so sweet. Nobody chat.
Think of these like the fire alarms or fire sprinklers of our economy. If we held a lighter up underneath our heat sensor here for a while, what would happen?
It's probably outdated, not do anything. We don't like.
These sprinklers would start giving us all the nice little back.
Oh my
That'd
god,
be
that was
awesome.
great.
Good job.
Automatically.
Right away.
Now, if we didn't have automatic sprinklers,
Run over.
we would have to see the fire, call the office, get hold of the right person, to find the person who has the key to the room where they can go in and turn on the sprinklers, and by that time,
We all
have the buildings burned down.
From a little tiny thing.
Because fiscal policy takes too long to enact.
That's why we was
So, what they did is they said automatic policies, things that will happen automatically. If heat, then water. If drop, then tax cut.
Check it out.
If fire.
Nobody has to think, nobody has to react, it just happens. For example, in a recession, our taxes fall automatically. You need to read the section in the book on this. It will explain it more clearly than I can do
Wait,
for you.
so why are our taxes falling down?
Because they implemented some fiscal policy. It was not an automatic stabilizer.
Wait, so you're
Congress
saying that,
specifically went above and beyond and passed fiscal policy that cut your taxes.
so you're saying that if we were to go into a huge recession right now, our taxes would go like even lower?
So again, read the section in the book.
Okay.
It explains it very nicely for you.
Okay.
I don't want to because I am afraid that I will say words that some will misunderstand and will confuse. It's 2 paragraphs that do it beautifully. Okay. Government spending. This happens simply through human action. We're in a recession. Kavanaugh gets laid off at the factory. He goes and he applies for unemployment assistance. The government's gonna pay him that unemployment assistance. Thus, government spending increases because they weren't paying it to him before he was unemployed.
Can you get unemployment?
And his partner, Sean, goes and applies for food aid for their 6 children.
6?
The government wasn't giving them food aid before.
Busy.
His partner. Oh, partner. I was like, they had a partner in the factory?
Wait, partner like life partner?
Yeah, life partner.
Life partner, 6
Ooh.
I was
kids.
like, I thought he was in
Six
a
kids.
factory, not a cop.
I know, Mark, you've been.
One from every continent in the world.
Seven, Mark.
Antarctica, they don't have a,
They got penguins. And penguins.
Paid $12.
no penguins. Right. So his partner goes and applies for food assistance for the family while the primary bread earner is out of work. Again,
Sean, are you
increased
okay
government
today?
spending, Congress didn't have to do anything. Guess what? That same government spending decreases as the economy recovers and Mark finds a job.
Wait, are they partners?
And they don't need, and then they don't need the food assistance for the
I knew
kids.
it.
Saw those juice boxes.
It's just too realistic.
They don't need the food assistance for the kids, so they stop collecting that because their income went up, government spending goes down. Nobody in the government did anything different, no policy changed. Follow how slick that is? The system is in place to help you if you need it, and if you don't use it.
You need to stop that guy and juice box.
Make it risque.
Alright.
Policymakers.
Here's the thing. The policymakers have to look at everything, short run and long run, across the board when they make policy changes. The problem is, even if they do that, the voters don't understand all of the implications of the policy. Voters vote in the right here, right now, where I'm at.
Yeah.
Does this make sense? So do politicians tell us that yes, they've considered everything?
No.
No, because what would that do to most of the voting populace? They would be, they would not understand, nor would they, for the most part, care, right?
Yeah.
Have you made my life better? Have you made my life worse?
Yeah.
Am I, and this is a great one, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? As a president campaigning
Well, I'm
for re-election,
graduating
are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? If you answer yes, guess what?
He did it
You
for
have
you.
to put them back.
now. Like a junior or something.
Whether that president or that senator or that representative actually did anything that made you better off. People are simple creatures.
Come on, Don.
They're simple creatures.
I don't know.
Here's the other thing.
Eating too much bacon.
I'm an elected representative in Congress. I'm there for 2 years. I may understand economics and know that what I'm doing in the long run is actually not going to be great for us.
Is that
But
because
in the short run, it's going to make things a little better. And I need to be elected again in the short run.
these
Yeah.
snakes?
I got
And you know what? If I get elected again, then maybe I can do something to fix what I know is going to go wrong in the future, because I'm going to have to run again. That's free.
Or they just keep doing
It's her doctor calling back to schedule her crippling depression appointment.
No, it's a reminder for Afir to go down and do her pre-administration of her AP exam.
Wait.
All right.
She's a freaking freshman. Honestly,
Pretty serious. Wait,
Yeah,
how is she
tomorrow.
Because she transferred in from Virginia, where freshmen take econ.
also she's smart.
Please excuse this interruption. Will all sophomores who are taking AP World History exam please report to the auditorium? We need to complete your pre-administration materials. Please bring a pencil with you and get straight to the
It's in the
auditorium.
book.
Thank you.